Welcome back. Tonight's story takes us to New Orleans, 1861, where a wedding meant to celebrate turned into a night of terror that history tried to
You
bury.
think you can hide?
Before
I
we
don't know
go
what
any
you mean.
further,
Liars,
tell
get
me
up!
in the
Please
comments
stop!
where you're watching from, and if these true, deeply researched stories matter to you. Please subscribe, because every episode you see here is built on long hours of digging through real records, forgotten accounts, and uncomfortable truths others avoid. Now, let me tell you about Dinah, an enslaved woman whose silence hid a storm, and how on one wedding night, vengeance finally spoke. New Orleans in 1861 was a city holding its breath. The air was thick with heat, river mist, and fear as the nation teetered on the edge of full-scale civil war. Slave markets still operated openly. Iron chains clinked on cobblestone streets, and plantation wealth masked a foundation built on suffering. Behind elegant balconies and candlelit parlors, violence was not an accident of the era. It was routine, accepted, and rarely questioned. The Mississippi River carried more than cotton and sugar through the city. It carried whispers of rebellion, punishment, and escape. Enslaved people moved through New Orleans as shadows, watched constantly, spoken about as property rather than human beings. Overseers ruled with absolute authority, and their cruelty was often measured not by necessity, but by mood. In 1861, power belonged entirely to those who held the whip. Plantations surrounding the city functioned like sealed worlds. Inside them, laws bent to the will of owners and overseers, and justice meant obedience. Screams rarely traveled beyond the fields, and if they did, they were ignored. For the enslaved, time did not move forward. It circled endlessly around pain, exhaustion, and fear. That same year, the South dressed itself in celebration to distract from its rot. Weddings among the white elite were grand affairs, full of music, wine, and laughter, staged as symbols of order and prosperity. Yet these celebrations were built on forced labor, unpaid hands preparing feasts, cleaning halls, and standing silently along walls, invisible but ever present. Nightfall in New Orleans brought a different mood. Oil lamps flickered, insects droned, and the city softened just enough for secrets to breathe. For enslaved women especially, night was dangerous. It was when power crossed into entitlement, when resistance could mean death, and silence became survival. 1861 was also a year of tension and transition. Rumors of war spread faster than truth, and fear made overseers harsher, not gentler. Control tightened. Punishments grew more severe. Any hint of defiance was crushed quickly, because those in power sensed their world might soon change. It was within this charged, brutal atmosphere that Dinah lived, watching, enduring, remembering. New Orleans did not just witness what happened next, it created the conditions for it. And when violence finally erupted, it was not sudden madness, but the inevitable echo of a city that had normalized cruelty for generations. Enslavement was not a single act of captivity, it was a daily system of breaking the human spirit. From sunrise to long after dark, enslaved people were worked until their bodies learned pain as routine. Hunger was constant, sleep was thin, and punishment arrived without warning. Brutality was not hidden, it was used deliberately, as a lesson to others, a reminder that resistance carried consequences worse than death. Physical violence was only one layer. Enslaved people were stripped of names, families, and any sense of future. Children were sold away from parents. Husbands and wives were separated with a signature and a price. The law offered no protection, because the law itself declared them property. In this world, suffering was not an exception, it was the structure. For enslaved women, brutality carried an added, unspoken terror. Their bodies were never fully their own. Abuse was common, unrecorded, and unpunished, disguised as entitlement by those in power. Refusal could mean beating, isolation, or worse. Silence became a form of armor, even though it offered no true safety. Overseers enforced this system with calculated cruelty. They were hired not for mercy, but for their ability to control through fear. Whips, iron restraints, and public punishment were tools of management. Each act of violence was meant to erase individuality and replace it with obedience. Compassion, if shown at all, was considered weakness. What made this brutality more horrifying was how ordinary it became. Violence blended into daily routine, accepted by those who benefited from it and ignored by those who feared becoming targets themselves. Pain was background noise to wealth, progress, and celebration. The suffering of the enslaved was considered necessary, even justified. Yet beneath this enforced submission, memory survived. Every insult, every blow, every humiliation was quietly recorded in the minds of those who endured it. Anger had nowhere to go, but it did not disappear. It settled deep, growing heavier with time, shaped by patience rather than impulse. Dinah lived inside this reality. Her suffering was not unique, it was representative. But what made her story different was not the brutality she faced, but what that brutality eventually produced. In a world designed to erase her humanity, something unbreakable remained, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Dinah learned early that survival depended on silence. On the plantation, speaking too much drew attention, and attention invited punishment. So she moved quietly, eyes lowered, hands steady, performing her tasks with a calm that made her nearly invisible. To the overseer and the household, she was obedient, forgettable, exactly what they wanted her to be. But silence did not mean emptiness. Inside, Dinah carried years of memories she never spoke aloud. Every insult disguised as an order, every strike delivered for mistakes she did not make, every moment of humiliation was carefully stored away. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she reacted. While others broke under cruelty, Dinah endured by remembering. Her suffering was not loud or dramatic. It unfolded slowly, in small, relentless ways that left no marks worth documenting. Long hours, withheld food, deliberate cruelty meant to test submission, these were daily realities. And through it all, Dinah learned the patterns of those who controlled her, when they were careless, when they drank, when they felt safest. Silence also gave her access. People spoke freely around her, assuming she did not matter. She heard plans, gossip, frustrations, and boasts of power. The overseer never lowered his voice in her presence, never imagined she was listening closely. To him, Dinah was furniture, useful, replaceable, unthinking. What no one noticed was how her silence sharpened her mind. Patience replaced panic. Observation replaced fear. Each day added another layer of understanding about how the plantation truly functioned and where its weaknesses lay. She did not rush toward defiance. She waited for the right moment, because waiting was something she had mastered. As time passed, Dinah's quiet presence became her shield. The less she was noticed, the more she could endure without suspicion. This invisibility was not weakness, it was preparation. Silence allowed her to survive long enough to choose how her story would end. By the time the wedding was announced, Dinah had already lived many lifetimes in her own thoughts. What others mistook for submission was restraint. What they believed was fear was calculation, and when her silence finally broke, it would do so with a force no one was prepared to face. The overseer ruled through fear, and he made sure everyone on the plantation understood that power belonged to him alone. He did not need justification for his cruelty. Authority was reason enough. His footsteps were enough to silence conversations, straighten backs, and quicken hands. The crack of his voice carried the promise of pain long before the whip ever appeared. Punishment under his control was deliberate, not impulsive. He chose moments that would be witnessed, ensuring that suffering served as a warning. A single mistake could earn hours of agony, not because it disrupted work, but because it reminded others of their place. Mercy was rare, and when it was shown, it was usually followed by something worse, as if kindness itself needed correction. He took particular pleasure in humiliation. Physical pain healed, but shame lingered, and he understood that well. Public reprimands, forced kneeling, verbal degradation, these were tools just as effective as violence. For him, breaking dignity was more important than breaking bones. An enslaved person who felt small was easier to control. For enslaved women, his cruelty crossed into something darker. Boundaries did not exist, and refusal was treated as rebellion. Power gave him access, and the system protected him from consequence. Complaints meant nothing, witnesses were ignored, and suffering was dismissed as imagination or insolence. Silence was enforced as much as labor. Dinah knew his moods better than anyone. She learned how his cruelty shifted with the time of day, with alcohol, with praise from the plantation owner. She knew when his temper was unpredictable and when it was calculated. This knowledge was not comforting. It was necessary for survival. What made the overseer truly dangerous was his confidence. He believed himself untouchable, protected by law, skin, and status. He never considered that those beneath him might be watching, learning, remembering. His cruelty had gone unchallenged for so long that he no longer imagined consequences. By the time the wedding approached, the overseer felt secure, even celebratory. He had no idea that every act of brutality he had inflicted had quietly shaped something he could not control. The fear he spread so freely had not erased resistance. It had concentrated it, waiting patiently for the moment when power would finally be reversed. The plantation was built like a small kingdom, with strict layers of power that no one dared confuse. At the top stood the owner, often absent, enjoying wealth produced by hands he rarely saw. Beneath him were overseers and managers, men granted near total authority to maintain order, discipline, and profit. Their word carried the weight of law, and their decisions were rarely questioned. This structure depended on distance. Owners kept their hands clean by delegating cruelty, while overseers carried it out in their name. When violence occurred, it was explained as necessity. When abuse surfaced, it was dismissed as exaggeration. Responsibility dissolved as it moved upward, leaving no one accountable and everyone complicit. Enslaved people existed at the bottom of this hierarchy with no recognized rights. They were measured in output, not humanity. Productivity determined survival, and exhaustion was treated as defiance. Any attempt to assert individuality, emotion, refusal, even grief, was seen as a threat to the system itself. Fear was the glue that held this structure together. Public punishments reinforced obedience, while private suffering ensured silence. The system thrived on isolation, keeping the enslaved divided and dependent. Trust was dangerous, because betrayal could mean reward. Unity was discouraged, because unity led to resistance. Women occupied a particularly vulnerable position within this hierarchy. They were expected to work like men and endure exploitation without complaint. Their suffering was often hidden, ignored, or justified as privilege. Within the plantation's power structure, they were seen not only as labor, but as entitlement. Dinah understood this hierarchy intimately. She knew where power rested, how it flowed, and where it leaked. She watched how authority changed hands, how overseers acted differently when owners were present, and how cruelty intensified when no one was watching. The system was rigid, but it was not flawless. By the time the wedding preparations began, the plantation's power structure felt unshakable to those who benefited from it. Celebration reinforced their belief in control and permanence. They did not realize that the very structure they relied on, built on fear and silence, had created the conditions for its own unraveling. The wedding was meant to be a display of order and triumph, a carefully staged moment meant to reassure everyone that life on the plantation was stable and prosperous. Preparations began days in advance. Lanterns were cleaned, tables arranged, food prepared by hands that would never be thanked. Music and laughter were planned, while those who made it all possible remained unseen. For the white household, the event symbolized continuity, marriage, legacy, and power secured for another generation. Guests arrived dressed in fine fabric, speaking of joy and future promise. Wine flowed freely and the mood grew careless. Celebration created a dangerous illusion that nothing could disturb the balance they believed they controlled. Enslaved workers moved through the festivities like ghosts. They served drinks, cleared plates, and stood quietly at the edges of the room, absorbing every detail. No one watched them closely. Weddings made people generous, distracted, indulgent. Authority softened, rules bent, and vigilance faded beneath music and alcohol. As night deepened, the plantation took on an eerie calm. Laughter echoed through open windows while darkness wrapped the surrounding fields. Oil lamps flickered, casting long, unstable shadows across walls and floors. The line between celebration and vulnerability grew thin, though no one inside noticed. The wedding night carried its own symbolism. It marked the beginning of something new for the couple, a private moment protected by tradition and entitlement. Doors were closed, guards relaxed, and the estate settled into sleep. In their minds, danger did not exist on such a night. It was unthinkable. But weddings also altered routines. Paths were left unguarded, tools misplaced, doors unlocked. The plantation's rigid structure loosened just enough to expose cracks. What was meant to be a moment of unity and joy became an opening created by arrogance and assumption. For Dinah, the wedding night was not about celebration. It was about timing. Amid the music, the wine, and the belief that power made them untouchable. The plantation offered something it never had before, an opportunity shaped by distraction, darkness, and the certainty that no one was watching closely enough. Dinah's revenge was not a sudden eruption of rage. It was the product of years spent observing, calculating, and surviving. Every insult, every strike, every cruel command had been noted, stored, and transformed into strategy. She understood the plantation, its routines, and its weaknesses in ways no overseer ever imagined. Her patience had been deliberate, her silence intentional. She knew the overseer's habits, the rhythm of his movements, the moments when he felt invincible. She knew which doors were left unlocked, which paths were lightly guarded, and which rooms were rarely entered at night. To him, she appeared obedient, invisible, a woman broken by circumstance. In reality, she was a storm concealed behind calm eyes. The plan was precise. Timing mattered. Dinah waited for the moment when authority was at its weakest, when celebration had dulled vigilance, and when the arrogance of power made them careless. Her opportunity came on the wedding night, a night designed to display control, yet unknowingly exposing vulnerability. When she acted, it was swift and decisive. The overseer and the bride, symbols of cruelty and entitlement, were caught completely off guard. Dinah did not hesitate, and she did not falter. Years of suffering, memorized patterns of control, and careful observation culminated in a single, shocking act of defiance that left no question of who held power in that moment. The act itself was brutal and unforgettable. It was not just physical, it was symbolic. Scalping, in that context, was a message: no cruelty goes unanswered, and no system of oppression is unbreakable. Every strike, every movement carried the weight of the injustices she had endured. In that instant, she reclaimed the authority that had been denied her for so long. The plantation erupted into chaos. Shouts filled the air, doors slammed, and the illusion of control collapsed. Guests and workers alike could not comprehend what had just occurred. For some, it was terror; for others, disbelief. No one had anticipated that the oppressed, long silenced, could wield such power with precision. By the end of the night, Dinah had done more than exact vengeance. She had rewritten the rules of the estate, if only for that night. Her act would ripple through the memory of the plantation, a terrifying reminder that even in a world built on fear, patience and courage could overturn the seemingly unassailable. The wedding night, meant to celebrate control and legacy, instead became a testament to resistance and retribution. The scalping sent shockwaves through the entire estate, shattering the illusion of safety and control that the plantation had carefully maintained for decades. People who had considered themselves untouchable now realized that the power they relied on could be challenged, even violently. Fear replaced confidence, and whispers of the event traveled quickly among the workers, both enslaved and free. Guests at the wedding fled in terror, unable to process the sudden eruption of violence. What had been an evening of laughter and celebration turned into chaos and panic. Chairs were overturned, lamps shattered, and the music that once symbolized joy now echoed as a haunting backdrop to horror. The sound of footsteps and screams reverberated through the halls, carrying the story of what had just happened. The overseer, the embodiment of cruelty on the plantation, had been humiliated and physically violated in a way he could never forget. His authority, once unquestioned, now appeared fragile and vulnerable. Other workers, both enslaved and free, began to whisper, realizing that the social hierarchy they had accepted as unbreakable could be disrupted under the right circumstances. The ripple effect did not stop within the house. Nearby plantations and towns eventually caught wind of the event, and though detailed or obscured or twisted, the fear spread. Dinah's act became a symbol, a story passed cautiously in hushed tones. Even the most controlled environment could be shattered by someone who had been forced into silence. The psychological impact on the remaining enslaved population was profound. Some felt a surge of hope, realizing that vengeance and justice, however brutal, were possible. Others recoiled, fearing repercussions from both the plantation owners and the wider system of oppression. Dinah's action had disrupted the balance of fear that had governed their lives for so long. Even the bride, a passive observer in the power structure, was changed forever. Witnessing the violent reversal of power on what was meant to be a celebratory night forced her to confront the reality that the world she inhabited was built on fear and cruelty. For her, the memory would serve as a permanent, unsettling reminder of human resistance. By the time the sun rose over New Orleans, the plantation had been irrevocably altered. Dinah's act had sent a message not just to the overseer, but to everyone who relied on fear as control. The oppressed were capable of defiance, and no system, however rigid, could completely erase the human spirit. The ripples of that wedding night would echo long after the celebration had ended, reshaping how cruelty, power, and vengeance were remembered in that place. The story of Dinah's revenge did not end with the wedding night. It lingered long afterward, whispered cautiously among those who had survived the chaos. Fear and awe intertwined in the minds of everyone present, leaving an imprint that would shape behavior for months, if not years. People began to reconsider the unquestioned authority they had once taken for granted. News of the event slowly spread beyond the plantation, carried by travelers, workers, and servants who dared to speak. Details became fragmented, exaggerated, and even mythologized, but the core truth remained. A single enslaved woman had defied a system designed to erase her entirely. The tale became a warning to cruel overseers and a beacon to the oppressed. Plantation owners nearby began to watch their workers more carefully, but with a new, uneasy tension. They had believed in the infallibility of their control, yet Dinah's actions revealed vulnerability. The balance of fear that had maintained order no longer felt absolute. Even minor acts of defiance were now met with suspicion and overcompensation, demonstrating that terror was no longer enough to ensure obedience. For the enslaved, the event became a story of possibility. It proved that patience, observation, and cunning could transform suffering into a weapon of resistance. Though not all could act as Dinah had, the narrative empowered imagination, conversation, and subtle forms of defiance that quietly challenged the plantation hierarchy. Historians, when they recorded events years later, often left out the details, sanitizing the story or labeling it as an anomaly. But among those who lived there, the memory persisted vividly. It was a cautionary tale, a shocking reminder that cruelty carried risk, and that those deemed powerless could, under the right circumstances, reclaim agency in ways no one anticipated. The psychological shock did not only affect individuals, it disrupted the social dynamic of the entire plantation. Overseers became hypervigilant, owners wary, and workers more cautious yet secretly emboldened. Dinah's action had introduced uncertainty into a system that thrived on predictability, proving that fear alone could no longer guarantee submission. Ultimately, the ripple effects of that night extended far beyond the estate's walls. Dinah's vengeance challenged assumptions about power, control, and the limits of resistance. What had been meant as punishment and spectacle instead became a lesson in courage, calculation, and the unyielding human spirit, a story remembered in whispers, passed down as a warning, and preserved as a testament to the possibility of defiance even in the darkest circumstances. The story of Dinah did not fade with time. Instead, it became a haunting testament to the consequences of cruelty and oppression. On the plantation, people could never look at her the same way again. The overseer's authority, once absolute, was permanently tarnished, and the fear that had long governed the estate now carried a sharp edge of uncertainty. Those who witnessed the act, whether directly or through the aftermath, carried a mixture of terror and awe. The guests, servants, and other enslaved workers realized that control was fragile, and that the assumptions of invincibility held by those in power were illusions. This awareness spread quietly, altering behavior in ways that could not be legislated or policed. For Dinah, the night was both an end and a beginning. She had reclaimed a measure of agency that the plantation had long denied her. Every calculated step, every moment of waiting, had culminated in a violent assertion of her humanity. Her silence, once a shield, had become a weapon, transforming years of suffering into a single act of profound defiance. The overseer and the bride, central figures of the power structure, were forced to confront vulnerability in a way they had never experienced. The horror of the scalping and the sudden reversal of control left a lasting mark, not just physically, but psychologically. Their perceived dominance was shattered, replaced with a constant awareness that the oppressed were not merely passive participants in their world. Word of the event, though often distorted, reached beyond the plantation's borders. The story was told cautiously in neighboring estates and towns, carried as a whispered lesson. Cruelty could provoke unforeseen consequences. Dinah became a symbol, both feared and admired, of resistance against a system designed to erase autonomy and dignity. The long-term impact on the plantation itself was profound. Hierarchies, previously unchallenged, became tense and unstable. Overseers acted with extreme caution. Workers navigated their tasks with subtle defiance, and the culture of fear that had maintained order was forever altered. Dinah's actions proved that even in the most oppressive systems, one individual could disrupt the status quo. Ultimately, Dinah's story serves as a stark reminder of the power of patience, observation, and courage. It demonstrates how suffering, when transformed into careful calculation and decisive action, can overturn centuries of imposed control. The wedding night of 1861 was intended as a celebration of legacy and order, but instead it became a lasting testament to resistance, vengeance, and the indomitable human spirit.